Welcome back to Conflicts of Interest. This is episode 458. I'm the host, Kyle Anzalone. Just a reminder, at the Libertarian Institute, we are holding our summer fundraiser and we have matching funds. So if you want to head on over to the Institute and make a donation, that donation will be doubled. We also have great kit bags for all of our donors, including copies of our physical books, copies of our e-books, and other Libertarian Institute swag. So be sure to head on over to the Libertarian Institute and make a donation if you haven't already. And if you have, we really appreciate it. And you are helping to keep this show going and making sure I could keep writing all the articles I've been writing. All right, let's get into the news today. First story here is by Thomas Knapp at the at antiwar.com. Biden administration defends social media censorship operation. On Thursday, government lawyers went to court to defend federal meddling in content moderation decisions on social media platforms such as Twitter and Facebook. On July 4th, Judge Terry Daughtry of the U.S. District Court for the Western District of Louisiana ordered the federal government to refrain from communicating with social media platforms for the purpose of urging, encouraging, pressuring, or inducing in any manner the removal, deletion, suppression, or reduction of content containing protected free speech. That order is on hold pending the government's appeal, which administration lawyers and attorneys for the states suing over the issue be argued before a three-judge fifth in that appeals panel, and that's the Fifth Circuit Court. So the Department of Justice lawyer Daniel Tenney told the panel that the administration merely, what they say, informed the platforms of content containing misinformation, and the platforms regularly refuse the government's request that such content be removed. He said the notion that social media companies felt they had to bend to the FBI's will when half the time they didn't doesn't fit any of these theories. Meanwhile, attorney John Sauer, speaking for the states, claimed the platforms faced, quote, unrelenting pressure from the most powerful office in the world. And certainly that portrayal is far more accurate. We know from the Twitter files and the Facebook files, both of which I covered for the Libertarian Institute, it's very clear that there was a significant amount of pressure coming from the White House, and intentionally so. The White House was intentionally pressuring these social media companies to get them to censor more. So let's hope that this ends up going our way. But I want to say it's probably pretty likely that the government gets some of its censorship powers back after this lawsuit. All right, next up, I have a bunch of articles that I have written either for antiwar.com or the Libertarian Institute, mostly dealing with subjects on the war in Ukraine. So first up here, Zielinski fires the heads of all local draft boards after corruption scandal. And this is from August 11th at antiwar.com. Zielinski announced that he was firing dozens of officials responsible for overseeing military recruitment in each region of the country. The leader claimed the officials were engaging in revolting abuses of power. Last week, Zielinski says his administration had conducted a sweeping investigation into the practice at recruitment centers, and finding the investigation revealed numerous abuses, and they are frankly revolting. On Friday, Zielinski explained the investigation resulted in 33 officials overseeing corruption being charged with 113 overseeing conscription being charged with 113 crimes. And this is what Zielinski said in his video address. During the inspection of territorial recruitment centers, law enforcement agencies exposed cases of corruption, in particular dealing with the general mobilization, that's like the draft, the conscription program, which poses a threat to Ukraine's national security and undermines the confidence in state institutions. There isn't a whole lot of details on what exactly was happening, but officials heading the conscription office in Odessa were fired after acquiring over $5 million in unaccounted for funds. And so that's just one example. He fired the heads of all local draft boards. So it's not just our Odessa. It's going to be, Kiev and Lviv and all these other Ukrainian cities. So it's an awful lot of officials. And again, while Kiev did not give a detailed accounting of the crimes committed, Zielinski explained that most crimes involved bribing officials to avoid service in the military. He said, some officials took cash, some took cryptocurrency. That's the only difference. The cynicism is the same everywhere. Illicit enrichment, legalization of illegally obtained funds, illegal benefits, illegal transportation of personnel liable for military service across the border. And so Zielinski assigned his commander-in-chief of the armed forces to take responsibility for involving new officials, and he said that he wants the new officials to be injured veterans. Now, look, you could probably find a group of injured veterans who are morally upstanding people and who will not do the same thing that the former officials did. Likely, these people will face intense pressure to engage in corruption. And look, you know, if I were, I guess, a local draft official and somebody was coming to me and offering me $5,000 to help them get out of the country and avoid military service, I'd probably do it. I guess the only like morally questionable part of that is taking the money from people. But for me, you know, getting anybody out of the country who would have to otherwise probably fight, die, kill on the front lines of this war is a, you know, a morally correct thing to do. So you know, just want to throw all that out there. Now, corruption has been a rampant problem within the Ukrainian government for years. In January, Zelensky fired several senior officials for corruption. In March, the Wall Street Journal documented Ukrainians paying bribes to avoid being drafted, and I think they're paying like $10,000 each, so quite a bit of money. And look, I don't want to make it out that these officials are some kind of you know, noble people, because you know, at the same time they're, you know, scooping up these poor kids on the streets who don't have $10,000 to bribe their way out of the country. You know, they're taking these bribes and probably getting all they can from the sons of you know, the and wealthier young men who are able to get themselves out of the country. So young Ukrainian men drafted into the military have received minimal training, and many have died within a few days of reaching the front lines, which is a part of the reason why, you know, they don't want to sign up to fight there. All right, the next article I have here: Russia says it thwarted series of Ukrainian drone attacks on Crimea and Moscow. Moscow says Ukrainian forces have launched several drone attacks over the past week targeting Moscow and Crimea. After the sensitive Kerch Bridge was targeted, the Kremlin denounced these strikes as terror attacks and vowed a response. On Wednesday and Thursday, Russia says it took down 15 Ukrainian drones targeting Moscow and Sevastopol, a city on the Crimean Peninsula. The Kremlin noted its multi-layered air defenses were able to take out the drones with a combination of electronic and traditional air defense systems. Ukraine targeted Moscow with drones for a third straight day on Friday. And I believe the breakdown was every day, Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday. Last week, there were 2 drones that targeted Moscow, so the other I think that's about 11 drones that they fired were targeting Sevastopol. The next attack occurred on Saturday when Kiev used 20 drones in an attack on Crimea. The same day, the Kremlin reported it prevented a Ukrainian rocket attack on the Kerch Bridge, and that's the roadway that links the Crimean Peninsula with the Russian mainland. The Russian Foreign Ministry labeled the strikes targeting the Kerch Bridge as a terror attack and said there could be no justification for such barbaric actions and they will not go unanswered. Last year, the Kremlin significantly stepped up its attacks on Ukrainian infrastructure after Kiev damaged the bridge. Last month, Ukrainian intelligence officials said the drone attacks on Russia would continue to increase in scale. Russia says the U.S. is responsible for the drone attacks, and this is from the Russian Foreign Ministry. These attacks would not be possible without the help provided to Kiev regime by the United States and its NATO allies. The U.S. and NATO were training drone operators and providing necessary intelligence to commit such crimes. All right. Next up here is an article from Dave DeCamp, antiwar.com, August 10th. We now have Biden asking for another $24 billion to spend on the war in Ukraine. The White House on Thursday asked Congress to approve a $40 billion bill that includes nearly $24 billion in additional spending on the war in Ukraine. According to CNN, the $24 billion for the Ukraine war includes $13 billion in military aid and $3.7 billion in economic and humanitarian assistance, and then $3.3 billion for infrastructure projects for regions impacted by the war. The request came after a poll from CNN found that 55% of Americans are against more spending on the war in Ukraine. The bill also includes $12 billion in domestic disaster relief and $4 billion in border security. Media reports have said the White House would try to add Taiwan aid to the spending package, but it was not included in this request. The funds will be in the form of an emergency supplemental package, a type of spending not limited by the debt ceiling deal reached between the White House and House Republicans. And this is how stupid our government is. They are able to reach a debt ceiling that they could then add money to. So it's not really a ceiling, it's just arbitrary. And again, look at all this money, and they are trying to package it with domestic disaster relief and things like that. And they're going to say, heartless Representative Matt Gaetz and Thomas Massie, they just hate the people of Maui so much, they're unwilling to approve this aid package. And meanwhile, the government is going to steal, I'm sure, huge swaths of those billions of dollars before they even get to the people, and they're going to get there too late, and they're not going to do what the people really need that money to do. And additionally, you could talk about just passing that $12 billion of domestic disaster relief separately, or the security aid money. But what the White House wants to do is they want to make it politically impossible for anybody to vote against this bill, because the more dissent there is to this bill, the better chance that Rand Paul, Thomas Massie, or somebody else could say, well, if you want this aid, we would approve it, but only if it includes a special investigative general for the Ukraine aid. And that investigative general, as Inspector General, as I've talked about on this show, I think we'll find a alarming amount of corruption here, that billions of dollars in weapons have not ended up in Ukraine, that the White House is essentially unaware at times of what it is shipping to Ukraine, in the sense of like the amount of weapons. There's no flight manifest and things like that included with the weapons, so it's very much a disaster. And I think that special inspector general could really change the way Americans are looking at this war and this aid. But the White House is trying its best to make sure that doesn't happen. All right, next up here. Wrote this for antiwar.com on August 11th. Delays push F-16 transfer to Ukraine until next summer. Delays have caused the North Atlantic Alliance to push back the expected arrival of F-16s in Ukraine until next summer. Currently, only 6 Ukrainian pilots are engaged in the training program. According to the Washington Post, the revised timeline reflects that Western countries see F-16s as a part of Ukraine's long-term defense, but not necessary for the current conflict. Initially, the White House rejected plans to send F-16s to Ukraine. In May, President Joe Biden relented and said the U.S. would not stand in the way of its allies providing warplanes to Ukraine. After Biden reversed course, Kiev hoped to receive the F-16 sometime in September. Last month, White House officials said the U.S. was, in their words, rushing to get the warplanes to Ukraine, and it expected Kiev to have F-16s by the first quarter of 2024. On Friday, the Washington Post spoke with Ukrainian officials who said the timeline was delayed further until sometime next summer. Once F-16s start arriving in Ukraine, the impact could be limited by the number of pilots the West is training. According to 2 unnamed Ukrainian sources, only 6 pilots are enrolled in the first round of training, with 2 reserve candidates. The first step the pilots will undergo is 4 months of English lessons. The pilots will not begin conducting combat training until January, a process that is expected to last 6 months. One Ukrainian official told the Post that the West was dragging out the process of providing the F-16s to Ukraine. The Post said the delays reflect a divide between Kiev and its Western backers. Washington and some countries who have agreed to train Ukrainian pilots on F-16s view the plane as part of Ukraine's long-term defensive needs. The Pentagon's press secretary, Brigadier General Pat Ryder, said the F-16s are about our long-term commitment to Ukraine and a capability that won't be relevant to the current counteroffensive. However, Kiev and other European countries have consistently complained that Ukraine lacks air power and has been pushed by NATO into launching a counteroffensive without crucial military support. Ukraine's commander-in-chief said last month, "It pisses me off when some in the West complain about the slow start in progress of the push against Russian forces. They are needed because there's no other way, because the enemy is using a different generation of aviation." The White House maintains it gave Kiev all the weapons it needed to launch the counteroffensive. However, the Post notes that Ukrainian ground forces are attempting to retake territory and have been attacked by low-flying Russian helicopters. Additionally, American officials admitted to the Wall Street Journal that Kiev lacked the warplanes and artillery needed to launch a successful counteroffensive. Still, Washington hoped Ukrainian courage would overcome the entrenched Russian defenses. Sending F-16s to Ukraine will mark a significant escalation in Washington's proxy war against Russia. The Kremlin says it will view the warplanes as a nuclear threat, and Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov explained, "We have informed the nuclear powers, the United States, Britain, and France, that Russia cannot ignore the ability of the aircraft to carry nuclear weapons. No amount of assurances will help there." All right. Let's move on here and talk about the sappers. These are the Ukrainian deminers. I wrote this for antiwar.com on August 13th. Kiev sees more mine-clearing equipment as Ukrainian sappers take huge losses. The Ukrainian military has struggled to work through Russia's heavily mined defensive lines as the counteroffensive has dragged on for 10 weeks with little to show. Kiev is now appealing to its allies for more demining equipment. Ukrainians assigned to be deminers, known as sappers, have taken heavy losses in the counteroffensive. Speaking with the Guardian, a Ukrainian sapper said his deminers have suffered significant casualties, and he has to take painkillers just to keep fighting. On paper, our brigade has 30 sappers. In reality, it is 13, and for those who are active at the moment, it's 5. I inject myself with painkillers every day. Sappers are playing a critical role in Kiev's counteroffensive. For several months, Russian forces built up several layers of fortified defensive lines that Ukrainian forces are now attempting to push through. During the opening days of the counteroffensive, Kiev committed thousands of troops to push through Russian defenses. However, Moscow's defensive held, and Kiev suffered substantial losses of troops and equipment. Over the past 2 months, the Ukrainian military has relied on sappers to demine the Russian lines to allow other forces to push through. The task is massive as Ukraine has become the most heavily mined country on Earth, and the sapper that spoke with The Guardian said the sappers are under-equipped and merely rely on metal poles and TNT to clear the minefields. Ukraine's defense minister described the difficult situation facing the Ukrainian deminers and appealed for more aid. "We have skilled sappers and modern equipment, but they are extremely insufficient for the front that stretches hundreds of kilometers in the east and the south of Ukraine. At this stage of our deoccupation campaign, we critically need more mine-clearing equipment, from mine-sweeping draws to Bangalore torpedoes, and Ukraine's counteroffensive has dragged on for 10 weeks. Last week, the Washington Post reported the lack of progress was contributing to declining morale in Ukraine." And this is actually an article that I wrote up for the Libertarian Institute last week that I want to talk about next. Ukrainians have begun to despair as bloody counteroffensive yields small gains. According to the Washington Post, many citizens of Ukraine are adopting a darker mood about the war with Russia, and national unity is beginning to fray. The change in sentiment comes as Ukraine's spring counteroffensive fails to make any significant territory despite surging casualties. This is a quote from the Washington Post. Ukrainians much in need of good news are simply not getting any. One Ukrainian who spoke with the outlet said before people were united. Now she described a collective sense of disappointment. The sense of despair is driven by massive casualties in Kiev's counteroffensive. The Ukrainian that spoke with the Post said that most soldiers sent to the front lines die in just 2 to 3 days. Last week, Politico reported that Kiev had committed 150,000 troops to fight along 3 fronts. Nevertheless, the Pentagon admits that the Ukrainian forces have failed to make any significant territorial gains. Washington publicly claims it has provided Kiev with everything it needs to wage a successful counteroffensive. However, Western officials admitted to the Wall Street Journal that Ukrainian forces lacked critical equipment, and I've already talked about this on this show, so I won't go into it again. A Ukrainian soldier who talked to the Post said that she hoped the losses would be worth the price. She said, "We've got all these guys coming back from the front without limbs. I want the price they paid to be reasonable. Otherwise, it's just useless what they went through." Her husband, who is also a Ukrainian soldier, lost his leg, told the Post he would not enlist if he could make the choice again, adding Kiev is sending untrained soldiers to the front lines. He said they are taking everyone and sending them to the front without proper preparation. I don't want to be in the company of unmotivated people. So, I think this is really important, especially because this article is coming from the Washington Post, which means it's not just reporting on what's happening in Ukraine. It's kind of informing the American people of how the Ukrainian people are feeling. And it's not often that we get the perspective of the Ukrainian people that isn't anything other than rah Kiev from our mainstream media. So we'll see what the impact is. But people have talked about, and I've, just talking to people that I know will mention to me that they're seeing more negative stories about Ukraine. Now, not people that follow foreign policy or the news quite as much. They're just saying, hey, it's kind of interesting. There's more coverage of like corruption and that things aren't going so well for Ukraine. So maybe the mainstream media is just having a harder time holding back the flood of negative news, or the kind of, momentum in the hysteria has worn off a little bit. All right, I believe this is the last article of mine that I have on today's show. U.S., Finland negotiating defense agreement that would see deployment of American troops. Washington and Helsinki are working on a new deal to govern the military relationship between the two nations. Finland recently became the 31st member of NATO, doubling the alliance's border with Russia. According to Finnish state media, Helsinki and Washington are negotiating a new defense cooperation agreement, or DCA. YLE News, the Finnish state media outlet, said the new deal would be a significant departure from its previous DCA with the U.S. Finland held a prolonged policy of official neutrality prior to joining NATO earlier this year. However, Helsinki established deep ties with the bloc over recent decades. The new DCA will expand America's military presence to several Finnish bases, including ports and airports. The outlet reports the new DCA will permit the presence of foreign troops for extended periods, specifically for conventional military exercises, and grant U.S. military personnel access to facilities and areas within Finland for training, weapons storage, and equipment maintenance. The war games and NATO soldiers will be viewed as a provocation by Russia, which shares an 800-mile border with Finland. Helsinki already hosts NATO troops for military drills near the Russian border. When Helsinki announced its intention to join the North Atlantic Bloc last year, the Kremlin warned about additional international troop deployments in Finland. Last week, Moscow announced it would deploy additional military assets to its border with NATO members. Finnish negotiators have expressed some reservations about expanding the DCA with the U.S. YLE explains noting that the agreement excludes nuclear weapons, and Helsinki wants all integrate international troops deployments to be labeled as temporary. So these are pretty minor. I don't think the U.S. probably has any plans or necessarily wants to deploy nukes to Finland at this time. They already have plenty of nuclear weapons in Europe, and the deployments just being officially labeled as temporary probably isn't that big of an inconvenience for NATO. But that Finland has any reservations about this at all, I think is worth noting. All right. Last article on the war in Russia here, this one by Dave DeCamp from August 10th. The Polish defense minister said Thursday that Warsaw plans to deploy 10,000 troops on its border with Belarus as a part of a buildup that began after Wagner fighters traveled to Belarus. About 10,000 soldiers will be on the border, of which 4,000 will directly support the border guard and 6,000 will be in reserve. We will move the army closer to the border with Belarus to scare away the aggressor so that it does not dare attack us. His comments came a day after a Polish official claimed that Warsaw was planning to send 2,000 troops to the border. Polish officials estimate there are 4,000 Wagner members in Belarus. Last month, Polish Prime Minister claimed the Russian mercenaries were sent to Belarus to destabilize NATO's eastern flank and warned they would be planning provocations. So again, this buildup is very concerning. But it doesn't seem to me that NATO would be particularly happy with Poland if it invaded Belarus, and Putin wouldn't be very happy with Lukashenko if Belarus invaded Poland. I don't think either of these countries' major benefactors really want them to provoke another fight between these two sides. So in a sense, it seems unlikely to me that a war would break out here. The counterpoint to that is there's really no ability for the West to talk with Russia at all. And so it would seem very unlikely at the same time that any de-escalation could happen here. And so we could be looking at a very protracted cycle of escalation that could eventually work out very poorly and potentially lead to a war. All right, a couple of stories on Niger here before we wrap up. We've been covering the coup and the potential invasion. So ECOWAS is the group of economic community of West African states. I believe there's technically 15 countries in that group. However, one being Niger, one being Mali, one being Burkina Faso. I believe that the number of the members who are on like a suspended status because there was a coup in the country or something else happened to get them kicked out, it is growing, and is maybe like a third of the entire block now. So that's worth knowing. But anyways, on Thursday they ordered the activation and deployment of a reserve stores to restore constitutional order in the Republic of Niger, while also saying it would seek peaceful means to restore Niger's elected president. After the summit, the leader of the Ivory Coast said the West African bloc agreed to launch an intervention as soon as possible and said the country would provide a battalion of 850 to 1,000 soldiers. Now, I'm not sure how significant of a military coalition will be needed. Niger has a pretty limited military. I think most of their military vehicles are just guns mounted onto the back of like pickup trucks and things like that. A couple armored personnel carriers, a couple attack helicopters, a couple, meaning two, Russian, I think Su-25, so an older model of warplanes, and yeah, so I'm not sure what exactly this war would look like. My guess is that any fighting would have whatever, maybe then the Niger force would be able to fend it off. But if the ECOWAS force was able to win, I think one of the massive problems that they would have is what to do with Niger, then a country that has a lot of, ethnic, kind of cultural disputes between different groups, and then also a presence of jihadists, as a result of the West war in Libya and overthrowing Muammar Gaddafi, and how all the jihadists have gone from Libya to all these other countries in the Sahel region, including Niger. I'm not sure, if the long-term plan is occupation, how poorly that would go, but it seems like that would maybe almost be a bigger obstacle than defeating the Nigerian military. Now, even with the limited military equipment, maybe they can put together something significant. Although I imagine that this ECOWAS group will receive enough support from the West to, overcome Niger's limited military abilities pretty quickly. But I could be wrong about that. All right, so there is a report that Niger's military junta told Newland they would kill the former president if there is a military intervention. And I want to just, that's pretty much the story. And Brad Pierce, who writes on his Substack, Wayward Ramblers, a pretty good Substack. You should check it out. And we run his articles on antiwar.com, in the viewpoint section there. So you could find him there occasionally too. And one of the things that, he points out is it seems kind of unlikely that they would kill this, former president, like execute him because there was an invasion by Nigerian forces or the Ivory Coast. At the same time, he points out, well, that is what hostages are for. And so I'm not sure how serious this threat is, or maybe it's a little bit more of an empty threat, but at the same time, things could spiral out of control very quickly here. And, this, if the invasion happens, it could get very bloody in Niger very quickly. All right, last up here is a little bit of good news on this situation. This is Connor Freeman. He writes, Niger junta refuses negotiations unless coup leader is recognized, and ECOWAS postpones meeting on potential intervention. So a delegation of Nigerian Islamic scholars traveled to Niger for a meeting with the leaders of the military junta who took power last month. The group says the coup leaders expressed an openness to diplomacy. However, this account has been contradicted by a media spokesperson representing the junta, who claimed the negotiations with regional countries are impossible unless Niger's new leadership is recognized. And I'm not sure how much of this is about internal propaganda. Maybe they're worried about if they look to the people like they're negotiating, then maybe it'll look like they're not serious, or they're about to give up power and they could lose support of the people. It could also be that maybe both are true. Maybe the negotiations went well, and from the Nigerian side, they felt like what the junta was asking for wasn't completely unreasonable or something like that, even though it would seem to go against the core demands of the ECOWAS group. And they're saying that, look, diplomacy is possible. They're talking about coming to the table and talking here. And then the Niger state media is just kind of clarifying that, look, we're saying that talks are possible, but they're not that close yet. These statements come after a meeting of defense chiefs from the Economic Community of West African States, the ECOWAS group, was postponed indefinitely. The meeting was called to review the best options for military intervention, and ECOWAS has previously threatened to intervene militarily in Niger to restore the, what they say the elected president is to office. And so, maybe this is some good news. We had this ECOWAS group seeming to be de-escalating here. All right, everyone. I think that's where I'm wrapping up the show for today. Really appreciate you all tuning in. And again, if you head on over to the Libertarian Institute, make a donation. Really appreciate it. If you've already donated, thank you so much for helping to keep this show going. We'll be back with more episodes later in the week.